The referendum on membership in the UK is different in some ways from previous referendums on the EU, because it's only the second one where an existing member state, if you exclude Greenland, where an existing member state have voted on leaving the European Union. Now, the first one was in 1975, also Britain. Until recently, at least, if you talk to a lot of sort of the political establishment, they were fairly complacent about what would happen in the forthcoming referendum. The polls look pretty good. You know, it's saying, oh, you know, people are definitely going to vote yes. You know, look at the polls. The political parties are going to be in favor. They voted yes in 1975. People have a status quo bias and so on. Now, I sort of kept telling you really shouldn't look so much at the poll right now. The campaign hasn't even started. And you certainly shouldn't be complacent about holding referendum. It often doesn't go the way that the political elites hope it does when they call the referendum. So there have been more than 50 referendums on aspects of European integration. And now what's interesting about these referendums is that mostly they are called by governments, mostly by governments that don't have to call them. But in some cases, they have been lost even though the government and the entire political establishment, the business establishment and so on have been very much in favor. Nonetheless, you've had a majority of voters voting against. Party cues matter, although of course they don't matter enough that they can actually necessarily win every referendum. But people will not have a firm opinion, so they will look to the parties they normally support. But they will also vote on a lot of things that we might often not think about. Namely, do we like the government? I mean, you get a chance to vote. David Cameron put this thing on the ballot. I think he cut my benefits. I'm going to vote no. You know, people use it as an opportunity, use referendums as an opportunity to kick the government, to get their voice heard on something, you know, not necessarily on what's on the ballot. So anti-establishment feelings, protest voting, these things are very common in referendums. Of course, the Prime Minister has put himself in a more difficult situation in terms of putting so much emphasis on the renegotiation. So he not only will need to argue for membership, but he also needs to argue that he got something from Europe. People are going to change their minds a lot of times before the final vote will happen. We know that attitudes are highly malleable in referendums. It's very different from an election campaign. In this, on issues to do with Europe, most people don't have a very firm view, and they will only make up their mind in the campaign what they're actually voting on. A lot of it will depend on the dynamics in the campaign. Even if we say, oh, leaving the EU seems a big deal, and that's of course what the inside will argue, there are many ways in which you can frame it from the out perspective to make it seem not like a big deal, or in fact you'll get a better deal if you leave. Now, is it very risky to leave the European Union? It might be, but a lot of that will come down to the campaign and how it's framed. What happened in the Danish and Swedish case on the euro is that actually economic wise men came out and said it's not that risky to be outside the euro, it's fine. One thing you can say, and Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, has already said this by saying, well, first we tell them no, and then we get a better deal the second time. Another way of framing it is saying, no, if we say no, we get exactly the part of the EU we want, i.e. the single market, economic integration, and we don't get all the political bits that we hate. There are a lot of things that we don't yet know about what's going to happen in the campaign. How willing, what deal is David Cameron going to get? At the moment, people in Brussels are not terribly interested in talking to David Cameron because they're trying to solve what they see as a more important problem, namely the immigration crisis. So even if you have backing amongst the political parties, amongst what we might think of as the political and economic elite, you can't guarantee that it's going to go the way that you think it might go. The majority of voters will vote, make a rational decision about how costly it is to leave the European Union versus what might be seen as the gains in terms of remaining. So I think what the government would want to do and the yes side would want to do is make a credible argument that it would be costly in terms of sort of real cost to people's jobs, to the economy, to growth and so on, for leaving the European Union, while still retaining, of course, sovereignty in this country and sovereignty over key matters.